Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to be discussing an introduction to Buddhist psychology. And when we understand Buddhist psychology, we are embracing a process. Usually the understanding and the learning comes from a process rather than from some distinct object of knowledge. I can illustrate this through a reading of Heidegger. When I began reading Heidegger, it was one of the biggest intellectual challenges of my life. So many people give up in frustration, and many deal with the inability to get it by dismissing it as nonsense. So Noam Chomsky is notorious for this point of view. Today, of course, so many people do get it that critiques like those of Chomsky's reveal more about the critic than they do about Heidegger. When I went to my dissertation advisor complaining that I just read words and had no grasp of what Heidegger was saying, he just replied, "Keep reading." So I did. I kept reading, and one day it clicked. I learned from this process that getting something often involves letting go, surrendering, planting seeds that later grow and break into consciousness. It requires a certain faith in a seed. Buddhist psychology has been a similar process. The ways of thinking that are involved in Buddhist thought are a challenge to comprehend. Often it is a matter of trusting the process to, over time, reveal the way of thinking rather than immediate understanding. This kind of thinking is not like solving a math problem and is more like familiarization in undoing the familiar. It takes time, patience, and faith that there actually is something to get. After nearly 3,000 years, there certainly is something to get to Buddhist teachings. In Buddhism, there are traditionally three sources of information: Siddhartha Gautama's life as an example, the writings, and the community of those who practice Buddhism. As an American secular Buddhist practitioner, I usually ask students to read Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha to become familiar with the life of Siddhartha and the first Buddha. Siddhartha was a man who never claimed to be anything more than a man who woke up from false consciousness. Buddha is the Sanskrit word for awakened one. Every one of us has the ability to wake up. Once we do wake up, we are said to have become a Buddha. Think, for example, how you awaken in the morning from a dream, and you say, "Oh, it was just a dream," and what had come in the dream felt so real, but then upon waking in the morning, you realize that that was a false reality. Well, we could fall asleep at night and in our dream have the same experience, say, "Oh, we thought we were in reality." The blurring of reality, as Lao Tzu has taught us, the blurring of reality is a significant thing to think about. So if we take as the experience of shifting between waking consciousness and sleeping consciousness, we have an experience of going to and from some reality. And I think it really discusses the issue of realities, plural rather than reality, singular. Of course, in our sleep, the reality is the reality. In our awakened daily consciousness, day consciousness with sense reception, we have another reality. But this metaphor of experience, we can wake up further in waking consciousness, out of a habituation of internal states, and we can become mindful of this. And that's what we're talking about, this phenomenon of waking up. You can have the experience that you may have experienced from waking up from a sleep into a waking consciousness, from a waking consciousness into a transcendent consciousness. So sometimes Westerners read about Buddhism and think it's a religion. To some it is a religion, but not in the sense of a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. When Christians hear a Buddhist speak about Lord Buddha, they might interpret Lord as some kind of term for God. In fact, Lord simply means one who has some authority in something. It is not Lord as in the Christian Lord's Prayer. Much of the confusion about Buddhism has to do with trying to understand an Eastern tradition through a Western lens. This is part of the process. One must let go and become aware of a different way of thinking. In this way, some do practice Buddhism as a religion, but in the same way as a jazz musician might consider music to be their religion. I find Erich Fromm's definition of religion to be a useful one in understanding religion in a more universal way. He says any system of thought and action shared by a group which gives the individual a frame of orientation and an object of devotion. Fromm himself was greatly influenced by Buddhism in the final period of his thinking. I also think this is an interesting topic to think about the difference between spirituality and religion. As Fromm points out, religion has to do with certain group activities, certain community activities, certain rituals that are practiced within a shared group, whereas spirituality, in a Kierkegaardian sense, is something that's more personal. And one can certainly have spirituality and maybe even practice that spirituality in a habitual way outside of a group in a personal religion. I studied Buddhism as a psychologist. I did not learn in a temple, as do most Buddhists in Eastern countries, but rather from a private teacher. In the United States, it is more common to go to a meditation center or a university classroom to study Buddhist teachings than it is to go to a temple. Meditation centers, private teachers, and universities offer teachings that are not held in a temple, but rather in a classroom or a meditation hall, or on a beach or a mountain path. This can be called secular Buddhism. But from my experience, all Buddhism is secular in that it does not involve God or deities. It is common for Westerners to confuse Buddhism with its parent religion, from which it split, Hinduism, which does involve deities. Just as some Christians and Jews practice Buddhism in the West, there are those in the East who practice Jainism, Shintoism, shamanism, and other religions along with Buddhism. This can be confusing for those with a Western sensibility towards religion. The things to keep in mind is that Western and Eastern conception of religion can be very different. There are many different schools of Buddhism. In Zen Buddhism, as practiced in China, Japan, and in the West, what Buddhism is largely depends on the individual who practices it. The main way of learning in Zen is through sitting meditation. Zen means meditation, and Zazen means sitting meditation. One sits and meditates, and in the process arrives at various insights into the self, life, existence, and reality. Although the Buddha's life, the teachings, and the community all give us ideas of what will be realized through meditation, ultimately in Zen, the realization comes through direct experience in meditation. Each tradition in Buddhism offers different methods of meditation practice, but they all lead to waking up. In Buddhist psychology, we consider meditation to be a research method. Whereas much of Western psychology looks to research externally, in Buddhist psychology we research internally. We look within ourselves. This is called introspection in Western psychological research lingo. In this spirit, we begin learning the insights of Buddhist psychology through direct experience in meditation. This research is aided by the examples set by the Buddha and through the teachings of the various schools of Buddhism. When teaching Buddhist psychology in the classroom or to an individual privately, I have them first read William James' chapter on the consciousness of the self in his Principles of Psychology. James studied Hindu and Buddhist texts and was famous for remarking in 1902 that in 25 years Buddhism will be what psychology studies. Much of the insights that James presents in his Principles of Psychology are compatible with Buddhist psychology. James has done the chewing on the Buddhist texts and presents many of the ideas in terms that are easy for the Western thinker to understand. However, direct experience through meditation is the main way of studying. This is just our opening approach to understanding secular Buddhist psychology. And please keep in mind that this is a very individual experience, and there are individuals, especially specifically in Tibetan approach to Buddhism, as we'll see, where Buddhism that manifests in that culture, blended with different practices, may take on a more religious, classically religious, and maybe even metaphysical understanding of things that would be more understood as a religion. But this is an individual choice. One can practice the teachings of Buddhism as a secular life philosophy, just as one could take the teachings of Christ and not embrace the belief in Christianity. So in other words, we don't have to be a practitioner of a religious practice to find the teachings useful. And that's what we're doing in secular Buddhist psychology. We are taking teachings, and if for an individual the religious practice is something that appeals to them, if it's something that is of interest to them, they're completely open and welcome to pursue that as an individual. But it's not a necessary precondition for learning the Buddhist psychology as a life philosophy. Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome to part 2 of How to Meditate, an introduction to secular Buddhist psychology. And we're continuing our look at Buddhist psychology. The final words that Siddhartha Gautama spoke before dying were, "Be your own light." We can understand this as being one's own teacher. Although we can learn from the teachings of Siddhartha and others who came before us, our main way of researching in Buddhist psychology is through meditation. There are many different ways to and reasons for practicing meditation. But in Buddhist psychology, we categorize meditation into 4 categories: concentrative, generative, receptive, and reflective meditations. After we briefly understand what each kind of meditation is, we will study the most basic of Zen meditations called Zazen. It is important to understand from the start that Buddhist meditation is not interested in trances or mindlessness that might be the goal of non-Buddhist meditation. For Buddhist meditation practice, there is one goal: absolute engagement with the present. Mindfulness means not being distracted by fantasy or memory, but being fully aware of right now. Buddhist meditation practice is different than Hindu practices in that the Hindu practices involve non-mindful states. This distinction is very important to realize. Concentrative meditation refers to a practice in which the ability to volitionally direct and sustained attention is developed. Simultaneously, the ability to tune in or tune out to specific stimulus is cultivated. The stimuli which we face can be external, sounds, smells, tastes, sights, or tactile, or they can be internal, fantasy and memory. Generative meditation is used to generate love and kindness towards oneself and towards others. It can also be used to generate other qualities in one's life in which they wish to cultivate. Receptive meditation is a form of meditation which keeps one in the here and now, in a state of flow with the moment. Time here refers not to chronos or clock time, but rather to something like the ancient Greeks called kairos time, or the right time, being in the moment. Reflective meditation is used to work through and untangle an issue. It can be like a thought experiment, such as a Zen koan, or it can be like peeling back onion skins to arrive at some understanding of something. Reflective meditation works through an issue, uncertainty, or problem which one is facing. Although we discuss 4 types of meditation in Buddhist psychology, Zen speaks only of one meditation, Zazen, or just sitting meditation. Tibetan Buddhism describes 2 types of meditation, Vipassana, insight meditation, or Samatha, concentration meditations. Practices of Zazen, Vipassana, and Samatha meditations can offer the same experience as the 4 categories we discuss in Buddhist psychology. There are many different ways to categorize meditation practices and techniques. By learning Zazen practice, we can begin to do daily research into experiencing the world in a more direct way, to heighten our sense of awareness, and to allow the mind to settle in a way that can bring more clarity in our experience. Zen teaches us that the mind is like water. When the mind is anxious, like choppy waters, we cannot smooth it out with our hands or take any action to calm it. The very act of trying to smooth out choppy water will make it more choppy. Instead, we must do nothing and not interfere. Only through doing nothing will the water begin to calm and turn from choppy to placid. Zazen is the practice of doing nothing. One teacher, Kodo Sawaki Roshi, once often said, "Zen is good for nothing." What happens when we just sit and do nothing? That will depend on the sitter. If one commits to daily sitting practice, in time the mind will settle and new clarity will come about. So we do not meditate for any reason other than quieting the mind so that we can see through the things we have been taught by society, our parents and teachers, and our self-serving subjective bias. This leads a more accurate view of the world. To practice Zazen, one should sit on the floor in a posture in which the spine and pelvis can work as a sort of skeletal suspension bridge that supports the weight of the upper body with very little muscular support. Sitting in this way allows for a pain-free, sustained non-interference with the mind. It also allows for a full, enriching breath, which is the center of Zazen practice. We begin by sitting in the floor on a chair with our upper bodies supported by the pelvis and spine. We then either close our eyes and look closely and softly at the floor in front of us out of the peripheral vision. This means we do not focus but rather take in the entire visual field. Begin by turning the attention to the exhale. In Zazen meditation, we always breathe through the nose. Simply observe the exhale, closely focusing on the place in the nose where the cool air comes in and the warm air goes out. With each exhale, count to 10. When you get to 10, start over again. I do this for 10 or more times, and it is customary to set a timer for 10 or 20 minutes while meditating. I find this problematic in that timing preconditions an emphasis on chronological time, which undermines the later event of being in the here and now. Rather than setting a timer, I prefer to use malas or meditation beads. Often I use my fingers. It can also be helpful to use incense to bring an olfactory association to the meditation experience. When we smell the incense, we are reminded by the nose that we are in a time of practice. Although it is advised that we enter into Zazen practice without any goal or expectation, the very act of just concentrating on the breath trains the mind to focus, which is what we call in Buddhist psychology concentrative meditation. By not interfering with the thoughts or with intentions, we also come to receive the environment in the now, rather than fantasizing about the future, anxiety, or ruminating about the past, depression. This is what is referred to in Buddhist psychology as receptive meditation. As a practice continues, various insights arise for Zen practitioners. The very act of settling the mind allows the dust to settle for a more accurate experience of reality through the senses. The insights that are realized are the hallmarks of what Buddhists call reflective meditation. Finally, it is inevitable that our relationship with ourselves and with others will change through the insights and experiences of meditation. This is what we call generative meditation because we generate compassion and understanding of ourselves and others. So for the next week, just sit and become aware of your breathing. As you commit to this daily practice, become aware of what you experience about your body, your thoughts, your feeling tones, and your raw experience of the senses. Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome to our continued introduction to Buddhist psychology. This is part 3 in our series, and this time I'm addressing a question that someone submitted to me, and the question is, Dr. Joby, do you believe in reincarnation? I like Buddhist concepts, but I don't believe in reincarnation. Do I have to believe in reincarnation to study Buddhist psychology? And I think this is a great question. Firstly, to most Buddhists, the concept of rebirth or reincarnation probably does not mean what you think it means. That being said, there are some Buddhists for whom reincarnation is very important. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism in general, and there are various schools of Buddhism within Tibet, but in Tibetan Buddhism, rebirth plays an important role in their worldview. There are other Buddhists for whom rebirth doesn't enter into the conversation at all. Zen Buddhists, for example, tend to not be interested in the question. Zen is Buddhism in China and Japan. And for those interested in Buddhist psychology, the question overlaps with a conversation going on right now in Western evolutionary psychology, and that's of Lamarckian hereditary theory. Do we, in fact, inherit memories or physiological residue from our ancestors' experiences? The short answer to your question is American Buddhist psychology is interested in this life. What comes after it is not a topic of interest for most who study this form of psychology, and Buddhist psychology is interested in insights for living right now. That being said, you can very well meet a Buddhist psychologist who is interested in studying the idea of reincarnation and previous lives, and of course, the power of belief, as we know from William James. If one believes that there's past lives, or if one believes that there will be future lives, that will have an influence on how one lives now. So the question is a big question, and I would say that the individuals who are interested in studying the phenomenon of the belief of reincarnation would be quite different than individuals who believe in reincarnation. These are two different things. But for most of us in secular Buddhist psychology, we're more interested in the life philosophy as taught by the Buddhist teachers. To take a balanced look at the question, it's important to keep in mind a few things. Firstly, we must understand that what the concept is from within the contextual framework of Buddhism and Eastern philosophy, rather than from within our Western Judeo-Christian framework of understanding. Simply put, the idea of reincarnation held by most Westerners is based on a Christian concept of an eternal soul. This conceptualization of a soul has no relevance in Buddhism. It is important to understand that basic point in order to understand the concept more clearly. So in Buddhism, there is no soul as we would understand it maybe in a Judeo-Christian Islamic conceptualization. There's in Buddhism, there's no deity, there's no God like the the Hindu gods or the Christian God. Secondly, we are dealing with texts and teachings that are at least 2,500 years old. The concepts of reincarnation predates the Buddhist text and is a central concept in Hindu beliefs, just as the teaching and writing of the Hebrew and Greek text within Judaism and Christianity are not taken literally by most practitioners of those faiths. Neither should the lessons of Eastern traditions be taken literally. Many of the concepts discussed in ancient times were done so in a way that would speak to those being spoken to. Today, we must tailor the conversations to a different audience, mainly the Western Enlightenment tradition. The Enlightenment of the West should not be confused with Enlightenment of the East. These are two different approaches. One is about knowledge, the other is about wisdom. In Buddhism, the idea of meeting your audience halfway or framing an answer in a way that is best suited to that individual is called skillful means. In contemporary psychology of the West, it's most like Lev Vygotsky's concept of scaffolding. In other words, you have to remain aware of not taking analogical explanations literally. Now, this point, I should mention, not every scholar or thinker in this is going to agree with me on this. But what I'm proposing to you is that when you're reading texts that are 1,000 years old or 2,000 years old, keep that in mind that they are written, well, they're translated firstly, but they're written in a different context. They're written to meet an audience at that time. And just as most individuals who study, say, the Judeo-Christian text would not take the stories literally, but would take them metaphorically and look for lessons that are being illustrated, we can treat some of the concepts within Buddhism in the same way, taken as a way for us to have a general understanding of how something functions, but to take it seriously and literally is not necessary. And again, there are people who will take it literally, who will take the teachings literally. And of course, everyone has a right to think however they wish to think. That you have to we have to remain open to that, but we don't have to agree with it or adopt it for ourselves. In my studies of Buddhism, reincarnation of past and future lives has not been of much interest to me. Reincarnation or rebirth within my own life is of primary interest to me. That is to say, psychotherapists and teachers are focused on growth rather than stagnation within a person's lifetime. In psychodynamic psychotherapy, we seek to identify and change patterns of repetition compulsion. These habitual ways of being can be identified, understood functionally, and reconsidered. Through this process, a person develops a new way of being in the world and is born anew. In the Zen tradition, past and future is not emphasized, but rather present now is of importance. However, I think that there are some useful things to consider regarding the idea of reincarnation, which, at the very least, will give the reader a more textured understanding of the idea. So if we consider the idea of rebirth within our own life, in other words, many of us have the experience of looking back and finding significant moments in our life that have changed things significantly and has felt like a rebirth within our life. It's not a literal rebirth, but it's a rebirthing of a new self or a new aspect of the self, a new experience of life. So in that way, we can understand this idea of being reborn or reincarnated as being a certain rebirth within our own life, an awakening. Buddhism can be understood as an offshoot of Hinduism. The main difference between Hinduism and Buddhism is that Buddhism does not include supernatural gods or God, and does not include a concept of an eternal soul. The absence of the idea of an individual soul eliminates what most Westerners think of as reincarnation from the start. There is no soul. What is left that could, if there is no soul, what is left that could be reborn? This leads us to another problem within the Western understanding of reincarnation. In Buddhism, there is no self. much of what we study in Buddhist psychology is how the concept of self manifests through self-consciousness. And the awakening to the illusion of the self is the waking up from a life of self-conscious ignorance to awakened consciousness. If Buddhism is based on the idea that there is no self, then the concept you or I being reborn into a different body loses its meaning. As you can see, the concept is not what most Westerners consider it to be. This is complicated when I talk to beginners about the idea of no self or the self as illusion. It can take maybe years of study before one really grasps what this means. I can explain it to those of you who are psychoanalytically oriented and have a background in psychoanalysis, but that too, you need years of study to understand that. We know what projection is. Projection is when the understanding through psychodynamic theory that we see in others and we see in films and paintings and the world, we see more of ourselves than we do of the thing itself. So when we're describing our friend or someone we dislike, we're probably telling more about ourselves and our description of that person than we are of that person. This is an awakening in itself. This is waking up. Many people think that they're talking objectively when they're describing a movie that they saw or a person that they know and are completely unaware that the reality is a projection. It's coming through their own projection and understanding of the world. If one realizes that self is a projection, the sense of self is an illusory projection, and that underlying it's simply a concept that we come to believe in through our language, through our grammar, through societal teachings of the self, and many of the things that we believe to be true about the self are in fact beliefs. So one isn't anxious, one experiences anxiousness. And if you can understand the difference between being anxious and experiencing anxiousness, that's the difference between believing in the projection of the self and understanding that the self is a concept that we participate in. I would like to offer a few thoughts on how to go about thinking about reincarnation. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, not all Buddhists are interested in the concept of rebirth. For the Tibetan Buddhists, this is the Buddhism known in the West through the Dalai Lama. Reincarnation is particularly important. For Zen Buddhists of China and Japan, reincarnation is typically unimportant. It is a good idea to keep in mind that we are discussing various Buddhisms rather than one Buddhism. Each individual has the responsibility to come to terms with their own awakening, and this is one aspect which individual must address in their own personal process. It is said that Siddhartha taught that we are each reborn thousands of times each day. This can be understood in the same spirit as Heraclitus, who pointed out that we never step into the same river twice. Most Buddhists would argue that we do not step into the same river once. In other words, that which we see as permanent, stable object is really an impermanent flow or process. Taken in this way, the self is a process rather than an object. This was expressed by humanistic psychologists when they spoke of human becomings rather than human beings. If we think of being constantly reborn, we understand ourselves as a process rather than as an object. We are temporal rather than spatial. One might ask, if there's no self, we will explore this self-concept in another essay. What is left to be reborn? That question leads us directly to the understanding that reincarnation is simply another expression of the illusion of separateness with all other organic aspects of the world. In Western scientific terms, we are a collection of minerals that continue through time, through decomposition and growth, in a continuous cycle of life and death. In particular, I particularly like to think of Friedrich Nietzsche's understanding of reincarnation. Nietzsche expressed the concept in his idea of the eternal recurrence. Nietzsche urges us to ask this question: if I had to relive my life over and over again, how would I choose to live it? This urges us to be truly awake and volitional in how we choose to live. Nietzsche is not saying that we do relive our lives over and over again. However, he is saying that asking ourselves the question has important implications as to how we choose to live. The word choose brings up an important aspect of the Hindu concept of reincarnation, that of karma. This is another word and concept that is frequently misused and misunderstood in the West. Karma simply means action, volitional action. In particular, we call this free will. In the Hindu and Buddhist teachings, we understand karma as a momentum that influences our lives. Simply put, if you live a life dominated by expressing aggression, you will come to live a life that is surrounded by aggression. When you smile, people tend to smile back. When you play the tough guy, people will respond accordingly. In other words, your actions have direct influence on what you attract into your life. Your choices in how to act shape your experience in the world. In a more basic way, we can understand this idea that you will find what you are looking for in life. If you are always seeking out self-righteous indignation, you will find it, just as the paranoid person will always find persecution. This is very important to realize. The concept of karma is often misused by individuals who maybe have a sensitivity to having been injured and maybe have a desire for revenge, and they take comfort in saying, well, karma will get them, but that's not what karma is all about. That's a very self-serving view of what this this idea of karma is. Karma is simply action. If you do good, you'll invite good into your life. If you do poisonous, toxic, bad, evil things, you'll invite that into your life. And that's it. That's the concept of karma. You can build up this momentum if you're always out doing positive, caring, empathic, smiling, joyous things with people, you're going to tend to have a more joyous life. That's what you'll attract into your life. That's the karmic momentum. If you're out punishing people and scowling at them and acting aggressively and tailgating them and pushing them and being mean to them, you're going to find that your life it's going to feed back into you. You're going to get a lot of that back. That's karma. Nothing much more to it. Karma means free will, volitional action. It's your choice. Good choices and bad choices. Good actions and bad actions. Good karma, bad karma. When I began studying Buddhist philosophy and psychology, I quickly realized how malleable Buddhism is. Buddhism manifests very differently from culture to culture. In my experience, Zen Buddhism of China and Japan, as well as American Buddhism, has been of most interest to me. These schools of Buddhism are also less influenced by more metaphysical interpretations and ritualistic obligations and religious hierarchies. You'll find a lot of power hierarchies in Zen. You'll find a lot of ritualistic, religious obligations in Tibetan Buddhism, Bon Buddhism. And in American Buddhist psychology, we just study the concepts. We study the teachings and how they can help us to gain insight into our life and live well. I think it is important for each individual to encounter what speaks to them and follow that thread. Two books that have been very helpful in my study of Buddhist philosophy have been Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist and Buddhism Without Beliefs. These are both by Stephen Batchelor. Eric Fromm, Carl Jung, William James are all useful resources in appreciating the power of belief rather than the power of what is believed in. We can explore that idea in a future discussion. We have been introduced to quite a few ideas here, ideas that need much more thought, exploration, consideration, and these ideas can be food for meditative thought. I'd like to conclude this discussion with a reflective meditation. For the next week, sit down each day and meditate on the question, if the self is something that I learn, what is it exactly that would be reborn after my death? What are the implications for the Christian belief in being born again on your concept of rebirth? And if you are really adventurous, ask this question: can the self be killed without physically dying. Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome back to our Introduction to Buddhist Psychology. And today we are going to look at Siddhartha's first lecture. And the first teaching that I received from my Buddhist psychology teacher was regarding suffering as an opportunity for insight. After introducing me to the idea that suffering is a part of life that cannot be entirely eliminated, my teacher asked me to meditate on my suffering for the next week. This meditation involved being actively mindful throughout my day and remaining aware when I felt anxiety or frustration that led to certain activities, such as eating chocolate or smoking a cigarette. He asked me to simply become aware of the impulse, the desire, and to spend time with the feeling of anxiousness before fulfilling the desire. If I was standing in line at the grocery store and suddenly spotted the golden triangular box of a Toblerone chocolate bar, he asked me not to reactively buy and eat the chocolate, but rather to meditate on the desire and ask myself, what is it that I really want at this moment? What is the chocolate substituting for? This was my first exercise in mindfulness, reflective meditation, and breaking the habitual reaction to desires. It led to some insights into my desires, as well as the realization that I could choose to act rather than react to my desires. It also brought to my attention that experiencing the anxiousness that accompanied the desire was not the end of the world. In fact, it turns out that experiencing the anxiousness that comes with a desirous impulse isn't such a big deal. After a week of pausing and finding what I could learn about myself from the gift of frustration, I was becoming more tolerant and less fearful of experiencing the frustration that comes with not immediately fulfilling a desire. It also brought to my attention that such impulses for food or other habitual actions were a fill-in substitute for some other emotional need that was going on unaddressed. The Buddha's first lecture after his enlightenment is known as the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dharma Sutra. This is traditionally the first lesson that is taught in Buddhism. As Buddhist psychologists, we are presented with some of the most useful tools for helping ourselves and others towards a more mindful life. We learn in this discourse some of the central concepts of Buddhist life philosophy, as well as a feel for the way in which we come to experience insight rather than learn it as something to be followed. This is the fundamental difference between wisdom and knowledge. Buddhists often talk of enlightenment and nirvana. These two concepts are not the same, and how we understand them in Buddhist psychology might be different than how they are understood in other expressions of Buddhism. Enlightenment for Buddhist psychology is the awareness of the fiction of the self. That's what we call the ego. The Latin ego is I and me. And the resulting implications that come from that awareness. Nirvana is a state of being which results from the practice of the teachings of Buddhism and from following one's duty, one's dharma. Just a note on the word ego. In the West, we have a tendency to equate ego with narcissism or ego with self-importance or self-centeredness or selfishness. And that's not what ego is discussed as here. Ego, as in psychoanalysis, simply is the Latin term for the self concept, for me, myself, I. So when you see this word ego, don't think of this in some sort of egotistical or pejorative way. Just ego is just simply the experience of the self, the I-ness of me. Enlightenment is experienced as an aha moment. It's known as satori. Satori is one of those when the light bulb goes off and you realize something more clearly for the first time. It comes from the practice of what Buddhists call the threefold path. And the threefold path is how to act, so ethics, meditation practice, and wisdom through the study of the teachings. So the threefold path, the way you go about, say, dusting the cleaning off the mirror, cleaning the dust off the mirror so you can see more clearly, is first through ethics, how to act, The second is the practice of meditation, daily practice of sitting quietly, breathing, and letting the dust settle, letting the choppy waters calm so that you can see more clearly. And the third is through the wisdom that you get through studying the teachings, the sutras, the teachings, the writings, going to talks, hearing people, reading books, going to meditation center and hearing talks, whatever your way of studying the teachings is. If one begins a practice of acting ethically, meditating, and studying the teachings, one will come to realizations about life that are referred to as enlightenment. And through practice of the threefold path, the experience of enlightenment will eventually take place. So let's take a look at the ethics in Buddhism. Buddhist ethics can be simply expressed in the what are called the 5 precepts. And these are not commandments. There's no punishment for not following the ethical guidelines. They are simply guiding behaviors that will lead to enlightenment. The 5 precepts are: do not kill anything that's alive. Don't kill. Don't lie. Don't steal. Avoid sensual excesses. And do not use intoxicants. Now, how you come to terms with these 5 guidelines is a very individual thing. And we tend to, when we're coming from certain Western traditions, we tend to look for strict rules that we follow, and we can feel good about following the rules. This isn't about the rules. These are just do not kill. Now, what does that mean? For some people, that means don't kill anything, including bugs and cows and pigs and chickens and fish. For others, don't kill means don't kill other human beings. For others, don't kill might mean don't kill unnecessarily, but there could be necessity for killing. It's open to an individual's interpretation. Remember the final words of the Buddha: be your own light, be your own teacher. So you don't take these rules and follow them. You take these rules and integrate them, incorporate them into your sense of being. Don't lie, don't steal, avoid sensual excesses. Does this mean never have sex? Or does it mean avoid misusing sex in a way that's keeping us from having enlightenment? Sex is a distraction. Sex is a way to fill the void that we need to be addressing, that we're trying to escape from. How about the use of intoxicants? Some people will smoke marijuana to engage more clearly with aspects of themselves. Other people will smoke marijuana to get away from themselves. Which is the intoxicant aspect of this. So these are all open to interpretation. You meet some Buddhists who are vegetarians, who, because of the killing aspect of things. You have other Buddhists who are not vegetarian. You have Buddhists who drink alcohol. You Buddhists who do not drink alcohol. These are all open to an individual's comfort. And the main point of this is integrating them into your own life, thinking for yourself. These 5 guidelines for ethical behavior are further expressed in the Eightfold Path, which we will explore in a future discussion. But for now, realizing the 5 precepts will serve as a basis for mindful living. One of the most empowering aspects of Buddhism is that one must come to terms with the 5 precepts for oneself. These are not commandments for some authority, but rather are starting points for one to integrate into their own lives. For some practitioners, the first precept, do not kill, means becoming a vegetarian. For others, it does not. Each of these ethical guidelines are starting points for an individual to become mindful of and to work through on their own. In this way, Buddhist practice requires one to be their own light and to become mindful of their own responsibility for the conditions of their own life. In general, Buddhist practice is not some directive for others, but rather a system of coming to terms with one's own life. The practice of meditation, samadhi. Meditation is an ongoing process with many different techniques. For the beginner, the basic sitting meditation of following the breath is central to practice. Making this part of the daily ritual allows the mind to settle and set psychological conditions in place for reflection of the teachings. Buddhist understanding of the mind to be like water. One cannot calm choppy waters by some action like smoothing the water out with the hands. Any action aimed at calming turbulent waters will cause more disturbance. One must not do anything to allow the mind to settle through non-interference and non-action. And this is a concentration meditation called shamatha. And what we do in this is, it's the idea of, in order to calm, you don't do anything. You stop doing, you stop interfering. It's the concept of non-interference, of just letting things be on their own, and the idea that any action we take will further disturb things. So the first step in ourselves for gaining clarity, for allowing dust to settle in our own lives, for allowing the waters, the choppy, stormy waters of our mind to become placid, is to stop fighting it. Just stop, sit, and observe the choppiness and wait and let it calm down. And we wait by getting out of it, by not involving ourselves with it. Prajna is wisdom. Wisdom is not knowledge. Knowing facts and being able to reference or recite text is common amongst those who participate in university culture. Wisdom avoids clinging to knowing. This does not mean that one ignores the writings or teachings of others. Those writings and teachings are very helpful. You can acquire wisdom through meditation, but a good teacher and the right text can make it happen too. The important thing to remember is that knowing who wrote what, when, and why is a clinging to knowing. There's a certain safety in clinging to these facts that you can recite and use as power over others or boost up your own sense of importance, like a hoarding of information to prop up the ego. Wisdom, on the other hand, involves understanding without clinging. You are aware that you're aware of the teachings, but you do not put the ideas on a pedestal to worship. In this way, texts and teachings are a means to another end, not an end in themselves. We study text and listen to the lectures of teachers to acquire flexible, unattached awareness and comfort with ambiguity. Not knowing, this is quite different than the typical university experience in which one is focused on an exam score showing what they know. There are thousands of years of texts which deal with the teachings of Buddhist philosophy. Today, Western psychologists have written eloquent and insightful books which present the application of Buddhist philosophy and psychology to living contemporary world. The question many students have is, where should I start? I say jump in. Go to the library or the bookstore and spend some time discovering different books. Get a subscription to Tricycle magazine and explore the archives. Watch the classic television series on Eastern wisdom and modern life by comparative Eastern philosopher Alan Watts. These are great openings into Buddhist philosophy and application to everyday life. If you're trained in psychology or psychotherapy, I can suggest any of the books written by Mark Epstein or Jack Kornfield. My three personal favorites are by Fromm, Suzuki, and DiMartino's classic Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, Chogyam Trungpa's The Sanity We Are Born With, and Alan Watts' Psychotherapy East and West. Some of the Buddhist psychologists, the contemporary Buddhist psychologists, tend to have studied Buddhism in monastery or are Buddhists themselves and employ that in psychology, and you should keep that in mind. The approach I take, I'm not a Buddhist, and I don't practice Buddhist in a religious way, but I study and apply the concepts of Buddhism as a psychologist. And I think that Fromm, Trungpa, and Watts all are very similar to the approach that I'm taking, although Trungpa was a Rinpoche, a Buddhist monk. Even so, his teachings were geared more towards a practical, what we would call Buddhist psychology, a secular Buddhism. So again, that would be something that not everyone would agree with me on, but it's my reading of Trungpa. Wherever you choose to begin will be the right place for you to begin, so enjoy what you discover. Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome to the continuation of our discussion of what is Buddhist psychology. Today we're going to look at the topic of interconnectedness in Buddhism. One of the first lessons that one learns in wild mushroom hunting is that even the choice edibles can be poisoned by the soil in which they grow. Mushrooms that grow on a chemically treated golf course or along a roadside might contain toxins that are absorbed into the mushroom from the polluted soil. In this way, a choice edible can become poisonous to eat. This brings an awareness not only to the characteristics of the specific mushroom variety, but also to the soil or context in which it grows. Context becomes as important as the object. The ground becomes synonymous with the figure. We find a parallel in understanding our experience of ourself in both Eastern Buddhist and Western psychodynamic and existential psychologies. The Gestalt researchers of Germany were the most influential thinkers in developing what we have come to know as social psychology. Kurt Lewin, known mostly for his research on teaching styles, was a Gestalt psychologist. Levin's experiment in how the teaching style affects the classroom dynamics is studied by every psychology student in the American university system today. This study is often acknowledged as one of the first modern studies in social psychology, the role of context on the human experience. Another important thinker in social psychology is Fritz Heider. Heider's ideas in attribution are central to the working in social psychology. Heider, too, was a Gestalt psychologist. The main contention of social psychology is that phenomenon does not exist in the individual alone, but is a dynamic interaction between the individual and the environment, what Lewin describes as field theory in his classic discussion of personality. Through social psychology, we have come to appreciate the dynamic interaction or interdependence between figure and ground, person and environment, or as it is described in Buddhist psychology, interdependent origination. I ask my students in the university to go beyond the simplistic amusement of those Gestalt figures as mere illusions. We can get caught up in just seeing these illusions and being fascinated by them. But these figures, like the one that you see here in the blog post, can offer much more useful insights into reality than a fascinating trick of perception. We want to dig a little deeper in this. We want to get beyond the amusement to the meat, the significance for our lives. What these visual illustrations can teach us is the essence of German idealist philosophy, Gestalt psychology, and the Eastern concept of interdependent origination, or jiji-muje. What I have experienced is a thread, a sutra, between German idealism, existential phenomenological psychology, and Eastern thought. This thread has been observed by others, including Erich Fromm, Alan Watts, Stephen Baker, who wrote the text alone with others, An Existential Approach to Buddhism. We see not only a common insight between Eastern and Western psychologies, but also an important insight for living our daily lives. That insight is the importance, or rather the essential nature of context on the experience of the self. The idea of being one with everything is difficult for most Westerners to come to terms with. The traditional illustration for teaching interconnectedness is found in the metaphor of Indra's net. It is interesting that those Westerners who are most aware of the interconnectedness of being are typically found in the fields of theoretical physics and theology. Indra's net is much more illustrative of theoretical physics than it is of current practices in research psychology. Those in the lukewarm waters of the Enlightenment tradition are left feeling great skepticism towards the idea that I am not a separate being from others in my environment. It is contrary to the habitual teachings that we have been raised to understand reality through. However, if we examine our own phenomenological experience, Buddhist psychology calls this meditation, Western psychology calls it introspection, we find that our everyday experience is more like the above illustration of the context influencing the appearance of the colored strip, the ground interactive determination with the figure. How many times have we found ourselves acting in uncharacteristic ways under unfamiliar circumstances? The consistency of self, personality, then nothing more than what one experiences in a highly habitual and static state of daily routine? In other words, is our sense of self rooted more in our daily routines than it is in our internal makeup? One way of making this determination is through experience. Here's an exercise to experience what we are discussing. The poisons which the non-poisonous mushroom can absorb from the environment can be deadly to us. Buddhism describes 3 poisons that we can encounter, and they can be deadly to us as well: desire, anger, and ignorance. We can become aware of how anger and desire are part of the soil in which we grow when we become aware that what we experience as out there is a projection from in here. That is to say, when we awaken to the reality of our projections, we clean our soil of the poisonous ignorance. Do something that is entirely out of character, atypical to your usually daily or weekly routine. This does not have to be anything dangerous or dramatic, but it might be experienced as threatening. Experience some new environment and observe yourself in that new context. Do not judge yourself or the environment, simply observe. Be aware of what you feel emotionally, physically, and what thoughts the unfamiliar context brings up. Meditate on the experience and contemplate what aspects of yourself emerged in this novel context that were atypical to your experience. Hi, this is Dr. Joby. Welcome to part 6 of our Introduction to Buddhist Psychology, Siddhartha's first lecture, The Eightfold Path of the Middle Way. Continue our exploration of Siddhartha Gautama's first lecture, The Setting in Motion of the Wheel of Dharma Sutra. We turn to the central teaching of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path toward the Middle Way. The lecture, as well as it was delivered in a deer sanctuary in Sarnath, India, it is taught that after Siddhartha awoke to the insights of enlightenment, a Buddha means awoken one, he delivered this lecture to a small group of 5 people. This sutra, the Sanskrit word for sutra is like the English word for suture. It sews things together, it connects things, is so dense that and rich that we could spend years just exploring this one teaching, this one lecture. I would like to present a few concepts that are most relevant to psychology and life philosophy. This is the essence of Buddhist thought, and it's presented. Was presented in part 4 of this series. The Eightfold Path of the Middle Way and the Four Noble Truths. Siddhartha presented the Eightfold Path before he taught the Four Noble Truths, so I will follow the same order. The interesting thing about this ordering is that the Eightfold Path is the 8 ethical guidelines that one is directed to follow in the 4th of the Four Noble Truths. So this ordering illustrates what I think is a central teaching of this first lecture of Siddhartha, is practice leading to manifestation. And what do I mean by this? As an example from American psychologist William James helps us to understand this point. James developed the counterintuitive theory that we do not cry because we are sad, but rather we are sad because we cry. In other words, we first have a physiological response to an internal or external stimulus, and then we interpret that physical reaction in the context of the situation. In this way, James showed us that smiling can create the experience of happiness. This illustrates the teaching of the Eightfold Path and the Middle Way as an ethical approach that, if followed, can lead to liberation from the majority of our suffering. So the Eightfold Path is a collection of 8 ethical principles that center around moderate behavior known as the middle way. The logic is that in practicing of these 8 ethical guidelines will immediately affect the conditions of our life and decrease suffering. In Buddhist teaching, there is no possibility of entirely eliminating suffering from one's life. In fact, along with desire and impermanence, suffering is one of the defining characteristics of life. If one practices the suggestions listed in the Eightfold Path, one will experience a life that is significantly less dramatic and tumultuous, a life that is free from most experiences of suffering. But how can this be? How can we control the suffering that enters into our lives? Buddhist teachings demonstrate that the majority of suffering that we experience in our life is experienced due to a collaboration with our reactions and decisions. The Buddhist attitude is not easy to accept, but when we do, we take the first step towards liberating ourselves from the beliefs that keep us trapped in what psychoanalysis calls repetition compulsion. These are the dramas that we repeat over and over again with different people throughout our life. Transactional analysis is an offshoot of psychoanalysis. It calls these repeated scenarios scripts. Buddhist psychology asks us to accept, as difficult as it might be, that we are responsible for the vast majority of our suffering. The suffering that comes from the rare natural disaster or congenital or genetic issue are exceptions here. These are, however, rare compared to the occurrence of most of our suffering. The Buddhist attitude is to first accept and second identify how we are responsible for our own suffering. The question we come to ask is, how did my action, my karma, invite, create, or sustain the circumstances of my suffering? Once we begin with the attitude that we are responsible for our suffering, we gain the foothold for understanding how to liberate ourselves from suffering that we are experiencing. Now, just to point out that right now you might be identifying with something in your life and it might be causing you anger, that a Buddhist psychologist would suggest that your reaction to that is your responsibility. What I'm asking you to do is accept it. If you're really interested in feeling better, if you're really interested in liberating yourself from whatever has happened to you, just go with it, accept it, and give it a try. You don't have to believe it if it doesn't work for you, but see what happens if you let go of the idea that something is done to you, rather than you being a participant in the memory or the current situation or what's about to happen in your life. So depression, anxiety, etc. This is an example of what the Eightfold Path describes as the attitude of wisdom. I use the term wise attitude instead of the typically translated right attitude. Wisdom is what we are after here. Life as a whole rather than a dissected myopic field of vision. Right or correct view carries with it an unnecessary weight of judgment. This illustrates in itself the idea of a wise view. The Eightfold Path is divided into three categories, or suggestions for a better life, which greatly reduce suffering. These three categories are understanding, ethics, and meditation. The three suggestions for our meditation are careful and wise approach and concentration, mindfulness, and effort. The three suggestions for ethics are carefulness in speech, action, and livelihood. The suggestions for understanding are careful view, careful intention. I use careful here with an emphasis on a fullness of care. When one is full of care, they are aware of their own narrow self-interests, always keeping an openness to a wider perspective, a big picture wisdom. We approach each of the 8 teachings with the faith that practice will precede understanding. That is to say, we trust that if we make the choice to act with care, good karma, we will begin to see goodness manifesting in our lives. The idea of karma or volitional action deserves more consideration, and we will take care with that concept later. For now, practice the 8 guidelines and become aware of what changes take place in your life. Practice of careful view, careful intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration introduces moderation into our lives. The Taoist philosophy, which has strongly influenced Zen Buddhism, moderation is illustrated by the concept of reversal. Reversal is the way of the power, means that extreme behavior invites extreme behavior. When we are confronted with an extreme act of aggression, an aggressive response is often automatic response. In transactional analysis, a contemporary psychodynamic model by Eric Berne, we find that aggression, depicted as the controlling parent ego state, will frequently elicit the extreme response in the other. Some will respond with extreme aggression as a controlling parent, or with extreme submission as in the adapted child. In other words, when we act aggressively, people typically respond either with extreme aggression or equal submission. Both of these transactions go on ad infinitum. We frequently find ourselves in scripted relationships with others, in which the conversation always settles into one of these language games. However, if we act mindfully and in moderation, as the Buddhist Eightfold Path suggests, we can stop the habitual pattern of repetition compulsion. We'll continue this exploration with a look at each of the suggestions of the Eightfold Path and the Noble Truth.